Welcome back, it's nice to see you again. We're doing another Marvel tutorial today. This time we're doing She-Hulk Attorney at Law, the She-Hulk by Titania title from the latest episode. We're going to do this as a series, so if you want to see the next ones, make sure you subscribe. And if you want the finished project files, as always, you can support me on Patreon. Let's jump into this. First things first, open up Apple Motion. Honestly, the settings don't really matter. I like working at 30 frames per second. I like working at 4K, so that's what we're going to stick with. We're going to build this project up in layers. So first things first is the background. That's just going to be a plain rectangle set to a solid color. Once you draw out your rectangle, you're just going to come into Properties to center it out, and then we're going to go into Shape to get it to fit exactly to 4K, which is 2160 by 3840. If you hate Apple's color picker as much as I do, it might take you a second to pick out the bubblegum pink color that matches exactly to the title, or if you have a screenshot of it, you can just use the eyedropper tool in the bottom left, and then you can move on to the text. With the text tool, we're just going to slap down some text. Position doesn't matter, we just need to type out She-Hulk by Titania to match the text from the episode. We're going to worry about styling and positioning in just a second. Now that we have our text, let's crank up that font size and we're going to get it centered. So that means center aligned and also centered in the position tab. Now that gives us something that's pretty close in layout, we just have to get the styling. I like to use Helvetica Neue for this one. I don't think this is the exact font they use, but it has multiple weights. So I'm using ultra light for the She, and I'm using bold for the Hulk. And then I'm going to take the by Titania part and I'm going to shrink it down really small. And then you'll see this all the time in fashion brands. They increase the tracking to make it look, I don't know, fancy, I guess. But you just fiddle with that, get the tracking and the size to something that looks and feels nice. I'm going to go pretty small. Now that we have the basic style and layout, we're going to split it in half. So if you remember, it kind of breaks in half in the middle and the camera flies through. So I'm just going to draw out a rectangle and then I'm going to center it up. The X position is actually half the screen width, so 3840, but then half again because the cut is only halfway across the screen, so 3840 divided by 4. And then the size is going to be the full 2160 height, but the width is just the normal half, so 1920. Hopefully that math shakes out for you, but it's all multiples of 3840, which is a 4K canvas. Now with the rectangle on top in your stack of layers, you can change the blend mode. So you can either use Stencil Alpha or Silhouette Alpha to sort of flip between which half of the screen you're cutting off. So this is going to be our tool that we're going to use to make the two halves of our sliding door. Speaking of a sliding door, let's make that happen. So if we go to Basic Motion and we just go down here to Move, we can take our entire group and we can slide it over. So I'm going to move my little playhead over here and I'm going to speed up the animation by reducing the size of that behavior on the timeline. And then I'm just going to grab that and slide it all the way over to the edge. And so you'll be able to see, as we drag the playhead, it slides out of our way. Personally, I like the ease in motion, that feels nice. I don't know if that's what they actually use though in the show. Theirs is pretty fast, but I think for a general effect, I like the ease in. Now before we start getting fancy with it, we're going to duplicate this. And the reason is there's actually two layers of sliding doors. One is sort of this pink with a 3D metallic text, and the other is sort of a green with a pink text. So after I duplicate my layer group, I'm going to call this background one left background. I'm going to hide the left foreground, and then I'm going to start editing. First things first, I'm going to change the text. This is supposed to be the bubblegum pink, so I'm just going to come in here to Appearance, use the eyedropper, and pick the pink. And then for the background, I'm going to struggle again with Apple's color picker to get a better greenish blue color. I think it's supposed to be sort of her theme color, but yeah, there you go, tealish, greenish, bluish, but it matches the pink pretty well. Okay, now let's get fancy. We're going to come back in here and turn on our left layer, and we're going to change this to have 3D text. Now, if you're not familiar, Apple Motion basically only works with USDZ files, which have limitations for 3D, and text. Those are the only ways to do 3D in Apple Motion. So it's just a checkbox to get 3D text, and I'm going to dial up the depth. The material I like for this is sort of the chrome as a base, and then I'm going to slap some paint over the top of it to get the color. Luckily we have reflective paint that looks pretty metallic as is, so once we have that on there, I'm going to pick the color. It's sort of a goldish, yellowish, orangish in the original, so we're just going to dial in something that looks about right there. We're going to tweak this over time because we're going to add lights, and lights affect the color. We're going to keep getting fancy here, so we're going to add a 3D light, which will change our scene to be a 3D scene, and then we're going to toy with the parameters a little bit. So we want a spotlight shining in a direction, that's what a spotlight does, and then I want it to have a big wide reach, which is the cone. Now the soft edge is sort of the outer perimeter of the light, and I want it to be nice and feathered. The more typical parameters that you would expect from a light are intensity, so how bright is it? And then the fall off is, as it gets farther from the center of the light, how dark does it get and how quickly does it get dark? And so you can adjust the center size of the light, so how quickly it falls off into darkness, and then how dark it actually gets. And you'll actually see more of this effect as I pull the light back away from our center canvas. That's just with the Z position. And I'm going to recenter it here to add a little dynamism to it, and you'll start to see that this light actually makes a huge difference. Now this lighting is a little dramatic for my taste, so I'm going to dial back this fall off, which brightens up the edges. Now, something like 0.5 is all that I want. It really isn't supposed to be this dramatic looking, really 3D scene. I just want a little bit of variation to the lighting in the background. Alright, now what 3D scene would be complete without an actual 3D camera? So let's throw a 3D camera down, and this is what we're going to use to zoom through the cutout. I'm just going to add a basic motion here, which is the move, and then we're going to switch to a top-down view so it's easier to see what our camera's actually doing. If you've never used the 3D viewport before, this might be a little confusing, so I'll slow down a little bit here. You can see as I scrub through the playhead, the text at the top actually moves out of the way. That's because it has a move parameter. We added that. Now, if I play with the Z position on the move on the camera, you can see it actually moves closer. And this triangle shows what the camera can see. And so we want the text to slide out of view as the camera gets closer to it. So this is just a game of timing. We're just trying to get it so up in the top left, the animation looks like what we want it to look like. Now, that top left only shows up when you have the camera selected, so if you're trying to get the camera moved just right, make sure that you keep that camera selected so that you have that view. Now, one problem you're going to face is that there's actually a bug in motion, and that is as something gets too close to a camera, it actually ignores the fact that it's being clipped by a mask, and it just renders it anyway. I don't know what the cause of this is. Basically, the only thing you can do is at a certain point in your animation where it should be out of frame, you just cut off those layers so that they're not seen. So for now, we'll just set the playhead here. That's where the problem starts, and we'll adjust it once we have the finished animation. This last effect is optional, that's why I'm saving it towards the end. It actually, I think, adds a lot of depth, and that's a drop shadow on the background layer. So if we hide this foreground, you can see this green. They move out of sync with each other, so you'd expect there to be a little bit of light occlusion happening. So how I pull this off is just duplicating this layer and changing its fill color to be a gradient. Pretty simple. So if I grab this, duplicate it, and then drag it above the She-Hulk, you can use the magic of blend modes to make it look like a shadow. If you're not familiar, the best blend mode in my opinion is multiply if you're trying to recreate a shadow. Now it doesn't look right here, that's because its fill color is green, but if we change it to black or a gradient, it starts actually looking like it's casting a shadow. Even this blue looks like a cast shadow. So the trick is to set one side of the gradient to be completely white, so no shadow at all, and the other side is a dark blue, or I chose just black for simplicity's sake, and you can see it actually has a nice fall off, sort of like a shadow. The problem is it's going top to bottom, and so we just need to change the start and end position of our gradient. For the Y position, we just want it centered, but the X, we want it to go from right to left. We want the white to be on the right, left to be the black side. So the X, we're just going to dial this up, and you can see wrong direction, negative is not what we want. So let's grab the end, there we go, that's what we want. X is 0, and I want negative, I don't know, 600 or something. You can see you have these two parameters. One is the difference between the two edges of the gradient and how quickly it transitions, and the other is the actual position where the gradient starts. And so I dialed it in something like this, where the gradient starts kind of all the way on the edge and then it very quickly turns to shadow, but I think you can tweak it to your heart's desire. Now you might be thinking, cool, let's see this in action. I'm just going to separate these in the timeline a little bit so they animate separately. And you might be surprised to see that doesn't work. And that's because of one oddity of motion, which is the default blending mode for groups. Let me show you how to fix that. If I just select my left group and come up here to the properties, and I'm just going to change it from pass through to normal, meaning it won't pass through the mask that we created. I'm going to do that for both because we're going to be duplicating these layers, and voila. Now you can see the shadow may or may not be intense enough for you, but now you actually have a feel for the entire finished effect, and you can dial in the parameters to look just the way you want. Finishing the effect is simple. We just want to duplicate the left background and foreground layers, and then just flip everything so that they're on the right hand side. That means changing the blend mode on the mask, that means changing the direction of the movement, and changing the direction of the gradient on the background layer. And that's the finished effect. I like to jazz mine up with a little spin on the camera. It's a fun behavior. You don't need it, but this is really yours at this point to jazz it up any way you see fit. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. Your support really does mean the world to me. And we're going to have more episodes recreating more titles and effects from Marvel, so make sure to check that out as well.